Anatomy Lesson: The Story That Forever Changed Swamp Thing. A plant with the memories of a man might seem like an absurd concept for a comic book character, and, in many ways, it is. In his landmark run on Swamp Thing, Alan Moore set the stage for a radical departure from the tragic original characterization of a man physically transformed into a swamp monster to launch the hero horror series into a bold new direction. The intriguing path slowly revealed the moss-covered being represented an elemental champion with demigod-like powers. The born-again second-volume journey of Swamp Thing, the book and the character, begins with an innovative story arc, starting with an issue titled Anatomy Lesson. Who is the Swamp Thing? Longtime fans of Swamp Thing comics are familiar with the character's early and later origins. Peripherally aware pop culture consumers who caught Swamp Thing's movie, cable TV, and streaming appearances may find an expanded origin primer enlightening. Swamp Thing is a character with a tumultuous history. His arrival followed the debut of a similar creature in the horror anthology House of Secrets No. 92 in July 1971. The issue ranked among the best-selling comic books in history at the time. The incredibly garish cover caught people's attention and helped boost sales immensely. Set in the 19th century, the simple tale featured a murdered man returning to life as a swamp creature to seek revenge. Predictable. Not so predictable were the incredible sales. Strong sales certainly meant DC Comics would soon greenlight a green monster in its own monthly title. The 20th century modern Swamp Thing garnered a monthly series, but it, sadly, only lasted 24 issues. The first 13 of these issues featured the work of original creators Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson. Wein and Wrightson's vision was firmly rooted in the horror mold, similar to what was established in House of Secrets. In the first series, we learn of Alec Holland, a scientist attempting to create a biorestorative formula to help end world hunger by generating vegetation in arid lands. The lab where he works is sabotaged and bombed. Holland, caught in the bombing, bathed in the biorestorative formula, and engulfed in flames, jumps into the bayou swamp waters surrounding the Louisiana lab. The proverbial startling metamorphosis occurs. The biorestorative formula saves his life, but turns him into a swamp creature after fusing his damaged tissue with the organic swamp vegetation. Holland spends the next several years trying to find a cure and restore himself to human form. Alec Holland/Swamp Thing followed the travel from adventure to adventure while searching for a cure to his plight plot convention for years. Then, the series experienced a completely new spin when Alan Moore took over the reins as its writer in a new reboot. An anatomy lesson for a swamp creature. Although the first series run only lasted 24 issues, DC Comics gave the character a second chance in a second volume. The new series ran for over a decade to moderate success, gaining quite a bit of notoriety after Alan Moore reimagined the character with the saga of the Swamp Thing No. 21 in February of 1984. The debut story, entitled Anatomy Lesson, presented a stunning and shocking change to the swamp creature's origin. At the time, it was rare for the central characters in DC or Marvel to be open to experimentation. That would come later, due to fears that altering an established character could turn off loyal audiences. DC Comics seemed willing to take chances with Swamp Thing. The saga of the Swamp Thing didn't rank remotely close to a #1 seller. So, little concern existed about making changes. Books with a decent, small following and a limited market share often saw experimental approaches taken to increase interest. Frequently, such steps were desperate and failed. In this case, the new direction worked, although not to the degree of, say, Daredevil. In the issues leading up to Anatomy Lesson, readers assumed Swamp Thing met his end by way of a bullet to the head. When Woodrue, the Floronic Man, performs an autopsy on the corpse on behalf of the Sunderland Corporation and its megalomaniacal CEO, General Sunderland. Woodrue concludes the Swamp Thing is a plant and only a plant, not an altered human. Woodrue knows that the Swamp Thing is not Alec Holland and never was Alec Holland. Driven by the biorestorative formula, the organic vegetation in the swamp waters tried to save Holland but couldn't, so it duplicated him. The biorestorative formula created a man made of plants and transferred Alec Holland's memories into a new body. The Swamp Thing may believe it's Alec Holland because its intellect comes from the deceased's consciousness, but the real Alec Holland died in those swamp waters. Woodrue also knows that you cannot kill a vegetable by shooting it in the head. He allows the stunned swamp monster to revive, knowing that upon learning the sad truth about itself, it will go after the hated General Sunderland. Therein comes forth the central question of anatomy lesson. How would you feel if you were not who you thought you were? To say the effect on the Swamp Thing was devastating would be a dramatic understatement. Of swamp creatures and philosophical musings. The earlier incarnations of the Swamp Thing centered on an utter misnomer. There was no real Swamp Thing alter ego. Alec Holland never experienced a physical change after the lab explosion and exposure to the experimental formula. Alec Holland died. The plant tried to revive him, failed, and recreated an entirely different being that stole the dead man's memories. Swamp Thing can't find a cure to restore him to his human form because he was never human and never Alec Holland. A shock to the system rattles Swamp Thing, and shortly after discovering its true identity, the creature commits its first deliberate murder in revenge. Moore's violent touch conveys the notion that things have changed tremendously. Once the shock wears off, the former Alec Holland, now solely the creature called Swamp Thing, eventually returns to his bayou dwelling, falls into a self-induced comatose state, and enters the green, microscopic world of plants where the consciousness of the creature stays. At the same time, the body becomes a useless shell lying on the ground. This occurs in issue number 22, the second part of the story arc. The Swamp Thing cannot answer, if I am not who I am, then who am I? Living a life that has turned out to be a lie is not something anyone wishes to experience. Most do not. However, others do have to contend with the fateful realization that all they have known in life has been a lie. The great Karl Popper once famously noted that the right approach to life is to accept the possibility that everything we believe may be wrong. Few can accept such a belief for the obvious reasons. Yet, there can come times in a person's life when circumstances lead to an earth-shattering moment when all previous belief systems are cast aside. While some might be in denial of such a situation, those who are honest with themselves can accept that their life is rooted in falsehoods. The resultant pain and shock can be devastating. If you are not who you are, then who are you? For the Swamp Thing, the answer is a plant with the memories of man. An anatomy lesson, the first day of the rest of the Swamp Thing's life begins, and the experience is far from a pleasant one. Moore points out the one thing that kept the Swamp Thing sane was its connection to humanity. The creature believed it was human. Throughout Western literature, beginning with Beowulf, the scope of most works of fiction is the discovery and search for the individual. Until Anatomy Lesson, Swamp Thing comics tip that path. Afterward, the search for the individual and the individual's identity become lost. The Swamp Thing is not an individual and has no real identity. Or does it? A more upbeat theme that the book would eventually follow centers on rebirth, renewal, and rediscovery. While not Alec Holland, the Swamp Thing still lives and exists and can do good. In some ways, the creature's plight can be seen as a journey of a newly renewed self. The past must die so the future may live. The rebirth of the Swamp Thing may reflect a new, liberated future. Since the creature cannot become Alec Holland again, the Swamp Thing is free of the burden of trying to become Alec Holland. He can accept and be who he is. Steve Bissett's contribution. One additional point. Alan Moore had help in realizing his new vision. Steve Bissett does deserve an enormous amount of credit. Swamp Thing fell under the horror category in the DC line but still maintained many familiar trappings of a hero-style comic. Like Marvel's Werewolf by Night, Swamp Thing was and is a good guy. Yet, there is still an element of horror to the comic. Steve Bissett's very eerie artwork contributes to this. In many ways, it is evocative of Graham Ingles' work in EC Comics. The sequences where Swamp Thing goes berserk on Sunderland maintain a very EC style. Bissett creates a horrifyingly creepy look to the proceedings that complements Moore's somewhat melodramatic narrative. After Moore, other writers would have their turn with the series, which had its ups and downs, with each writer delivering their unique spin. The second volume suffered cancellation after a lengthy run of 14 years and 171 issues. Still, the cancellation hardly reflected the end. Numerous additional volumes and series kept the character alive in the DC universe. There are occasional homages to the original run of Len Wein/Bernie Wrightson, but the series has firmly remained faithful to the mythos created by Alan Moore.
And there you go. Alan Moore revamps the Swamp Thing with Anatomy Lesson, one of the cooler swamp creature stories in comic book history. And we will be talking more about swamp monsters in sequential art when we're going to take a look at Man-Thing from Marvel and the Heap from the classic days of comics, the really classic days, the Silver Age, and Atlas's very briefly published Bog Beast. Now we're going to move on a little bit into a very funky team-up of sorts between Spider-Man and Dracula. That's an oddball one, but first we're going to take a listen to a little promo for my book, Dreaded Invocations.